technology is becoming ubiquitous. So business strategy becomes the difference. That is the critical answer, is that marketing then drives that business strategy going forward. So it will always be critical.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, a podcast about how to win at business responsibly. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark, the mark of trusted marketing and communications. And our article this week is titled CMO Outlook 2026, which was published by Lippincott in partnership with Bloomberg Media. The piece covers a global study of over 500 marketing leaders, which finds that CMOs are quietly deprioritizing long-term brand building in favor of short-term performance metrics, even while most say sustainable growth actually depends on the long-term work. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say that our guest today is Dr. Leeya Hendricks, an expert in B2B marketing strategy and platform ecosystems. She's managing director and founder of Hark Consultants, a non-executive director on the CIM board, and the author of the B2B marketing book, The Platform Playbook. Leeya, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show this morning. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
No, excellent to be here. I'm so thrilled to have this discussion with you. So thanks, Charlie.
Well, I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation with you because I think knowing your background and experience in the various roles that you've had as a CMO, I think you're perfectly placed to have this conversation. Now, in terms of the article, I want to get your overarching kind of view of it, but I want to kick things off with my observation, which I want you just to sort of help me understand. So this article essentially suggested, I think, that in order for CMOs to essentially build legitimacy with their C-suite peers, they are having to start implementing more short-term thinking when they know, as marketing leaders, that the most value that they can redeem from their work is to think long-term and to think about brand value over a longer-term development cycle. How can those two things be reconciled?
Oh, this is such a great, conversation and interesting article. So thanks so much for sharing it. I think the tough thing today is that today's marketing leaders are increasingly expected to drive commercial growth. When we think of customer insight, you think of digital transformation, you're thinking of AI adoption today, and they're balancing the short-term performance with their long-term brand value. So I don't think necessarily it's a case of giving up the one for the other. It's more the demands of some of the boards. It's the ask sometimes of the kind of macro economic factors, microeconomic factors. But at the same time, I think the role remains really under pressure to drive growth. It's about becoming more aligned to the organization's need for measuring marketing's capability also. So if you think of marketing's requirements or asks, it's that marketing really has to deliver through quarterly outcomes rather than strategic long-term value creation. And I think that's it. The article really reinforces that marketing is becoming, more of the integrated element of business strategy. And I think that's where I think the difference is that there's still work to do in ensuring marketing has a real voice in executive decision making. So it's not about, kind of giving up the one for the other. It's that marketing needs to have the conversation around how organizations create sustainable growth in an increasingly complex world. So one thing that really struck me is that AI is no longer the headline act, right? I think it's becoming the opening act, as it were, or rather the operating environment, as it were, right? We're all operating on that level, and that changes the conversation. The question isn't simply whether marketers should be in the boardroom and really having those long-term, short-term conversations. It's whether boards have the capabilities really needed to lead organizations in an AI-enabled economy. So I'm going to stop there, but I think that's really my view around the article.
Just to be clear, you're essentially sort of disagreeing with one of the insights that was gleaned from this piece of research, which was that CMOs feel like they're having to give up that long-term, view, that long-term perspective when it comes to building brand value through successful marketing in order to talk the talk with their C-suite counterparts.
No, not at all. I'm saying that it does happen. I think the only thing I'm saying is I'm moving the focus a little in the sense that I'm saying it's marketing's role to really have those conversations where you are driving that strategic discussion. So it shouldn't be a case of, boards imposing that need for short-term value because there's a need for the business to really show, profitable growth. Yes, of course, that is always going to be a business need. But the fact that marketers get pushed, and I use that in inverted commas, into short-term thinking is because marketers really need to be more strategic in showcasing the value of what we bring to the table. So therefore, it'll change that dynamic on, yes, we need to be focusing on short-term, deliverables and results. But no, wait, this is the value that we can bring. And this is the strategic elements in why it should be long-term thinking balanced with short-term thinking. So do you see where I'm coming from? It shouldn't be an either or. It's actually marketing kind of often sitting back and saying, but hey, okay, if that's what we're doing, great. But no, it shouldn't be that easy. We should, and we as marketing have always been the voice of the customer. We are the ones, and I say we because, of course, wearing my marketing hat, that is, where I stand from across business. But that's the thing. It's not just marketing. I'm a business leader as well. And we should start stepping out of that. And that's my view, is that it shouldn't be a case of us being forced into a space. It's the job of a CMO. It's the job of the marketer to really have those strategic long-term discussions in saying this is the value that we bring. And therefore, it shouldn't be short-term and year us out. And so that's what I'm saying. It's kind of flipping it.
And Leeya, I think, and again, that's so interesting. And I have to say, I think we're recording on the 31st of July, 2026. So as soon as you were describing that, I immediately jumped to Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, which is obviously all the rage around, and immediately started thinking of a Trojan horse. I was thinking, if marketers, if CMOs, marketing leaders have had to start talking the talk from a short-term perspective in order to get themselves into those conversations, in order to build integrity with the rest of the C-suite, then actually it's now that they're in those spaces, they now have got a job of sort of encouraging and sort of educating, if you like, the rest of the C-suite around the role that marketing can play in building that long-term value. And that's the kind of, it's almost, I'm sorry, that's probably a slightly nebulous kind of analogy to draw, but a timely one. The idea is you've got to talk, and it's same for sustainability professionals. I have this conversation a lot about CSOs. CSOs need to start talking that more commercial language, if you like. So is that a fair observation, or do you think I've stretched that a little?
No. I mean, I really like the kind of analogy around the Odyssey. And I would probably say that's my view. Is some of the problem is the fact that we shouldn't be looking at ourselves as a Trojan horse, right? In the sense that we're coming in with this kind of facade, right? And we're tricking the boardroom into, okay, we're in now, we're kind of, changing things. And that's really what it was. But it was strategic, right? And I think that's the thing. It's not about marketing necessarily finding a way into it. It should be by default based on us showing the actual value. Marketing has had to wear many hats. And I think based on that, the credibility has kind of, diluted in that sense. It's because we get pulled into doing elements for HR. We get pulled into doing elements for legal. But that is also our positive in the fact that we're able to bring many environments within the organization together to create value. However, understanding what's our true value has always been the problem. And we need to kind of have elbows out, be very definitive in terms of going back to the basics of what marketing really offers and what we actually do. And that's the critical thing. It's not necessarily the Trojan horse of getting in, but really being that definitive understanding of what our strategic value is. How are we really going to war in that sense? And how will we actually, come out at the other end? And by that, I mean war in terms of, kind of profitable growth. How are we going to do this? What is our strategy? And then believing in that to really drive those outcomes.
I think it alluded to the fact that like CMOs typically feel like they are charged with this ultimate outcome of growth for an organization and being the custodians in many ways of growth for an organization. But equally, they then have no control over some of the key levers within an organization which would help to enact growth.
I've experienced that similarly in different roles. As you mentioned earlier in my introduction, I've been fortunate to actually be in 3 CMO roles in 3 different organizations. And it rings true in terms of, I guess, autonomy, but also owning some of those areas. And I think it goes back to, and what's worked for me successfully in some of those instances when I found myself in that position and have come out of it, is working with your counterparts. And it might sound cliche when you think of how do you actually, translate that value? How do you communicate that value? It's really just being clear in terms of understanding where you come to that, determinant, I guess, outcome of results. So for me, it's always been a case of who owns the voice of the customer. And that's always been some of the kind of confusion is like, well, to your point, right? If you're not owning it, but then at the same time, you're the only one that has to deliver growth, that's not true. The entire organization needs to come together to deliver growth, right? You can't just say it's the marketer's role. But I think the voice of the customer sits with the marketing team to really enable that growth.
What was your initial view when you read the stat within the article that I think it was 14%, only 14% of CMOs interviewed felt very confident that their organization is prepared for what's coming. And I think what's coming is kind of the allusion to, the disruption as a result of AI, et cetera, and perhaps some of the geopolitical and environmental and social issues that we have at play across the globe. Was that number expected, or was that a surprise to you in terms of that?
No, I think it's pretty much expected. It's merely because organizations themselves are struggling with foundations. So because things are changing so much when you think of your data at the moment or in systems, the data is not necessarily aligned or the foundation is not there. So marketing is becoming, siloed in that sense. So marketing is no longer necessarily the key contributor to driving all of those foundations. And it creates a lot of, confusion, as it were, for marketing to actually enable that growth. So when we're talking about the business, yes, it's not a surprise that businesses are not set up for it. But at the same time, marketing is required to really be part of those discussions. And it doesn't only require marketing to really set those up. So I use this as an example. Marketing needs to help drive, let's say, for example, CRM, or the way GEO, AEO, everything's moving so quickly, yet marketing needs to work with the technology team to enable the foundations of the data, or else the AI capability won't work. Falls on marketing once again to get that right, or else things won't actually push through. So I hope I'm making sense there. I'm using one small example because in the article, it really talks about whether organizations are ready and organizations aren't ready. And I'm using one small example as to why they aren't ready, but there's 10 million other examples I can use.
I've got 2 more kind of key fundamental questions I want to ask you on. And one is, beyond being clear about the role of marketing, how do we address that? How do we make kind of marketing leaders feel more appreciated within organizations? What does that need to look like?
The evolution for me is more the fact that it's not just one siloed role, right? And this is the second key point that I keep raising, is that I think the CMO should become a business architect. And I know this might sound, combined, because I'm saying at the same time, marketing needs to be focused on its core, what it stands for, but at the same time, be able to speak a language of the rest of the business as well. So you can't only live in your marketing silo, come back to the value that you add, but at the same time, fully understanding that you add value in the other key areas of the business as well. You have to have the understanding of technology and data, right? Because that's the future. It really is where, where marketing is evolving to. And in organizations where marketers don't understand AI or haven't adopted AI, or don't fully understand systems or technology, you will fall behind. It's just, definite. When you think of the legal requirements, has become part of the role, the organization. CMOs need to understand that. So when I talk about a business architect, I think the future of CMO needs to spend, less time, managing campaigns and more time shaping business models. In many organizations, there's still this requirement of, okay, what's the next campaign? How are we actually going to drive that? It's not about communicating only the brand. It's about actually understanding the other elements that's involved in it as well. So you're shaping business models, you're shaping ecosystems, you're shaping platforms. And that then becomes the strategic value that you add. The role becomes one of connecting the people, the technology, data, commercial strategy, far more than just, and it's still marketing, but it's understanding that it's not just campaigns.
I'm a much more junior and less experienced marketer than yourself. So I'm sharing my own experience here, but I appreciate it's not necessarily, as aligned as yours is. But there is that nagging element for me as a marketer, as a comms person, that, we look at the world around us and you just see that, so much of the problems that we found ourselves in from an environmental and a social perspective are to do with our overconsumption of resource and essentially extractive, models of economy. How does that reconcile with you?
I think that is such a, critical point, an inflection point for us as marketers, especially, in this time of AI. We said, yes, that's a whole separate, session and an episode if we wanted to focus on that. But I think the value of marketing remains, I think it's very critical to every organization in the sense that it remains the voice of the customer. So I think when we think of the overconsumption and, I guess AI, and I want to touch on that topic because we're talking about, responsible, sustainable growth. I think the biggest concern for me when I think of value or if I think of organizations is that there's still this, I guess they still underestimate marketing by viewing it primarily, I guess, as the communication function. And I spoke to you about that earlier around campaigns, rather than that strategic business discipline. But if marketers aren't actually involved in shaping that AI strategy, the data governance, the product innovation, the commercial transformation, then I guess organizations risk making decisions that are, I guess, technically sound, but commercially disconnected from customers. So that answers your first question around whether, I guess, marketing is critical. And I still think so, even in this era of AI. But if marketers aren't involved in AI strategy, governance, product, you're thinking of all of this business transformation, but they're not necessarily looking at the organization's risk in building technically impressive solutions that actually can create meaningful value long term. And that's where marketing can get involved. Technology is becoming ubiquitous. So business strategy becomes the difference. That is the critical answer, is that marketing then drives that business strategy going forward. So it will always be critical. What I'm saying is that with AI really, transforming things, and AI has, of course, replaced or really looked at that operational, aspects where marketing can really focus more on the strategic element that really drives the business forward. Those agents become a key part of your ecosystem. So the organizations that thrive won't be those with the most AI. They're the ones that create the best conditions for people, partners, and intelligent technologies really to create value together. And so perhaps it's the very human things for me, right? That become the key thing. The biggest value will increasingly come from how organizations connect people and AI in these ecosystems. And I know I refer to it continuously, but it is about continuous learning, adapting, and creating value. So when you think of those elements, I think that when we refer to customers, we're seeing the same pattern. And I'm going to use this in an example because I think we haven't really necessarily touched on examples. But where I see customers doing it really well is, for example, the same pattern that we see in legal, right? I refer to this legal element because we're talking about ethics, we're talking about governance, doing the right thing. But look at Harvey and Leggera, right? They aren't disrupting law because they have AI. They're disrupting it because they reimagined how value is created. That's a strategy conversation, not a technology conversation. We're already seeing this in industries like the legal services, right? Traditionally, law firms, they competed on expertise and billable hours, right? Today, companies like Harvey and Leggera aren't simply adding the AI to legal work. They fundamentally rethinking how legal services are delivered, how they engage with their customers. They're removing the repetitive work, they're augmenting professional elements and enabling lawyers really to spend more time on higher value judgment, client relationships, strategic advice. And I think that's where marketers need to be focusing their time on getting back out to speaking to customers, right? If I think of my, first CMO role, we'd actually go with the sales teams to customers, to engage with customers, to hear what the customer is saying firsthand. That is what we need to be doing, building relationships with customers, hearing the value of customers, understanding the high value judgment, the strategic advice, not sitting behind the scenes, in the office and then expecting that everything needs to be done from the desk, and it's all on our shoulders. So that's what I'm saying. That's the different model of value creation.
I'm so pleased you used the term relationships in much of that response. I think as you've alluded to, one of the great advantages of technology and the advancement of technology as it is it allows us as marketeers and communicators in order to lean in to that core foundational function of relationship, understanding relationships and building relationships. And I think, to your point, I think I can see that as one of the key elements of the toolkit of the marketeer moving forward. I want to conclude with the magic wand question. If I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I'm all about growth, as you know. So if I had a magic wand, I'd change how, organizations define value. I referred to that earlier around, creating value and marketers' role to enabling strategic value. And so a big part of my research is also value. How do we define that? And so the magic one for me would be, we'd move beyond quarterly performance as marketers and CMOs and really create businesses that measure long-term value across customers, employees, partners, society, and shareholders. So responsible growth isn't about sacrificing commercial performance. It's really about creating businesses that can sustain it. And that would be my magic wand.
Can I just push back on, are you really, while we have our, legal requirement for public companies to maximize profit for shareholder returns within a quarterly structure, is that what needs to change fundamentally for us to get the magic wand outcome that you've just described?
No, not at all. So I think I'm talking about the narrow thinking of how we operate in terms of the requirements for marketing. So I sit on boards and a lot of the kind of discussions is, okay, when we meet in the next quarter, how are we looking at the next quarter? And when I'm talking about the long term, we also refer to in some of our board discussions and ones that work really well, is you looking at that forecast, but you're also looking at beyond. And I think that goes back to our previous point around short term. So are you looking at quarterly to quarterly? Yes, you are, right? Because you have to really report on that. But at the same time, are we looking at that beyond? And that is what marketing's value needs to be as well. When you're looking at the strategy, how are you enabling different ways of working that could have different discussions beyond this quarter to next quarter? We need to be doing that, but at the same time, really looking at the sustainable value of what the business could look like in future. And the reason why I'm going to share this, and I know it might, kind of get slightly controversial. But if you watch the latest, I don't know if you've actually listened to the latest interview from Elon Musk in The Economist, which I found fascinating. He paints this future of abundance where AI and robotics can do almost everything humans can do, right? So making work largely optional, right? Whether that happens in 5 years or 10 years or much longer is almost secondary. But the more interesting question is whether, if AI can do more, what becomes uniquely human? And so why I'm raising this quarterly and the sustainable business is what I'm saying is we get bogged down of only what is now, but what about what can change in 5 to 10 years? If you listen to that interview, you think, wow, this is mad thinking. But is it, if you look back, things have changed so quickly? Are we only focused on what could be now in the next 5 years, or are we also focusing on what could be in the next 10 years? And I don't think the answer is nothing. I actually think it makes humanity more important, not less.
Leeya, what a brilliant place to conclude on. That was, I know, a whistle-stop tour, and we've only touched upon certain subjects, but that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time this morning and joining us for a show of The Responsible Edge.
Oh, thank you so much. It was so wonderful to speak to you, Charlie. And yeah, I'd be really, really happy to have another conversation with you on another topic. Thanks a lot.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to Dr. Leeya Hendricks for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted marketing and communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.